What secret vow was made in hushed tones between Princess Anne and her brother Charles that could shatter the very foundations of royal trust? For decades, this moment remained buried beneath ceremony and smiles until now. Anne's silence wasn't forgetfulness, it was protection. And the truth behind her broken promise is far more explosive than anyone dared to imagine. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began quietly, almost too quietly for history to notice. In the late 1980s, when the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon the shoulders of the then Prince of Wales, Charles found himself cornered by the demands of duty and the chaos of a crumbling marriage. The world saw a future king adorned in medals and ceremony, but behind the palace doors, he was a man uncertain of his destiny. Anne, the sister who had always stood slightly outside the glare of royal drama, became his refuge, a rare voice of reason within a family suffocating under its own traditions. Between them, an oath was whispered, one never meant to reach the public ear. It wasn't written in ink or recorded in the annals of the crown. It was spoken in trust, in blood, and in desperation. Anne's promise to Charles was simple in its form, but heavy in consequence. She vowed to protect something he could not: his reputation, his emotional fragility, perhaps even his future reign. No one knows the exact words exchanged that night, but those who've studied the family's dynamics describe a bond that transformed into a secret pact. Was it personal, born from compassion for a brother in turmoil? Or was it political, woven into the complex strategy of preserving royal image amid Diana's growing influence? The truth remains blurred, but one thing is certain. The vow became Anne's invisible burden. As years passed, the promise grew roots that entangled her every decision. She became the silent stabilizer of a kingdom teetering between evolution and collapse. When others faltered, when scandals splashed across headlines and loyalty wavered, Anne remained composed, her lips sealed. Yet behind that stoic demeanor lay the echoes of words she could never take back. Every public appearance beside Charles reminded her of what she carried. Every glance a reminder of the line she dared not cross. Duty became a cage, gilded but suffocating, and with every passing year, that secret oath began to erode the steel that once defined her. Anne's silence wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Her restraint, often mistaken for detachment, was a shield against a storm the public never saw coming. She believed she was protecting the family, the monarchy, and perhaps even Charles from himself. But what she didn't realize was that promises, once made in desperation, have a way of twisting into shackles. What began as loyalty soon became a curse. And as history moved forward, that silent vow transformed into a haunting presence in both their lives. A shadow cast over every royal smile, every balcony wave, every carefully rehearsed gesture of unity. For years, Anne carried this unseen weight, believing her silence would preserve peace. But in the unseen corridors of Buckingham Palace, whispers began to grow louder. The same vow that once united them was now driving a wedge between two of the monarchy's strongest pillars. And though no one outside the royal circle understood why Anne's eyes sometimes lingered on Charles with quiet sadness, those close enough sensed something had broken long before the world would ever hear about it. But as history marched forward, that solemn vow would become a curse Anne could no longer carry alone. As Charles moved closer to the throne, the promise Anne made began to weigh heavier than the crown itself. Behind public smiles and diplomatic handshakes, she was haunted by a secret that began to tear her apart, and the burden didn't just threaten her conscience. It endangered everything the monarchy was built to preserve. Time did not ease the vow, it sharpened it. The years following Diana's death were a slow-burning storm. Public trust in the monarchy wavered, scandals chipped away at the family's polished image, and Charles, once poised as the future king, found himself buried beneath the ghosts of his past. Yet, through it all, there was one constant: Anne. But she was no longer just his sister. She had become the keeper of something volatile, something capable of reshaping everything if revealed. At first, she told herself it was worth it. that shielding her brother's vulnerabilities was part of the job. That silence, however agonizing, was noble. But noble sacrifices have limits, and Anne's was beginning to fray. The emotional toll was silent but suffocating. What began as a quiet unease morphed into a persistent ache. She spent long nights alone, haunted by what she knew and what she had promised. The palace halls became cages, and royal engagements became performances of poise masking internal chaos. The very institution she'd sworn to uphold began to feel like a web closing in around her. It wasn't just the pressure from the outside, it was the private moments. The subtle reminders from Charles himself. He would allude to their shared history at dinners, in casual conversation, even during official visits, always careful, always veiled, but always reminding her, and every time, Anne felt a little more like a prisoner of her own word. The strain began to surface in unexpected ways. She grew terse, less agreeable in meetings, no longer the reliable stabilizer royal advisors once praised. It wasn't rebellion, it was erosion. Years of swallowing her own truth had hollowed her out, and cracks had begun to form. During a private strategy session on public perception and succession, Anne's composure broke. She questioned the direction, the narratives being pushed, the deliberate shaping of public memory that erased pain for the sake of image. Her words were measured, but her eyes gave her away. There was more she wanted to say, but still, she didn't. Not yet. Still, the shift was undeniable. Charles noticed it. So did the courtiers. The unshakable Princess Royal had begun to waver, not out of malice or ambition, but because the promise no longer aligned with the reality it was meant to protect. The monarchy was changing, but not in the way she had hoped. Her silence had protected a version of the crown that no longer existed. Now, it merely enabled the illusion. And while Anne clung to the belief that loyalty would lead to peace, a deepening part of her knew the truth: peace was no longer the goal. Control was. Legacy was. And she was being asked to sacrifice her integrity for a legacy built on a lie. And just when it seemed Anne would stay loyal to her word, a devastating betrayal reignited the fire. Anne had accepted many things in silence, but Camilla's ascension was the line she could no longer ignore. The woman who once tore the royal image to shreds was now poised to be queen, and in Camilla's rise, Anne saw not triumph, but the unravelling of everything she'd vowed to protect. The signs had been subtle at first. Camilla's presence, once controversial and hidden in shadows, began to creep into the heart of royal life with a calculated ease. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now celebrated in public ceremonies. Titles shifted, public sentiment softened, and with each new step Camilla took toward legitimacy, Anne felt the walls closing in. She had kept her promise to Charles, endured in silence, upheld a lie, swallowed her doubts. But this was betrayal wearing a crown. For Anne, Camilla's proposed title as Queen Consort wasn't just a political move, it was a violation of the deepest kind, a distortion of the very vow she had made to her brother in trust and loyalty. That promise, once sacred, now mocked her with every headline. Behind palace walls, the tension exploded into fury. There was no press, no decorum, just the raw, unfiltered clash between siblings who had once been each other's protectors. In a meeting that would never appear in the official records, Anne confronted Charles with the cold fire only betrayal can ignite. She demanded answers, asked him how he could stand before the world and allow Camilla to ascend on the back of Anne's silence. He didn't deny it, he justified it. He spoke of legacy, of healing old wounds, of reshaping the monarchy's future. But all Anne heard was manipulation. Charles had used her silence, her loyalty as a tool to pave a cleaner path for Camilla. And in that moment, Anne realized she hadn't been guarding a secret to protect the monarchy. She had been guarding a weapon, and Charles had pulled the trigger. The confrontation left scars. Anne didn't just leave the room, she walked out of the entire summit, head down, hands trembling, her silence finally broken by the roar of betrayal in her chest. For the first time in decades, the fortress of restraint she had built for herself began to crack in full view of the family. The whispers spread instantly. Courtiers murmured of the fallout, advisors scrambled to contain it. But nothing could undo the moment Anne chose her conscience over the crown. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a reckoning. That day marked the shift. Anne had always been the monarchy's hidden blade, sharp, precise, and loyal. But now, the blade had turned inward. She no longer believed in the fantasy they were selling. The monarchy she'd protected wasn't the one being shaped now. It was a polished illusion, and her silence was its foundation. And though she had walked away from that room without saying a word to the press, her absence spoke louder than any royal statement ever could. And then an anonymous leak reignited the world's attention, forcing Anne to face the truth in the passers' spaces, the harshest spotlight yet. A single envelope, no return address. But the contents sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. A private letter written by Anne years ago had been leaked, and its contents didn't just hint at betrayal, it confirmed it. The promise was real. And now, the world demanded answers. The leak was surgical, precise, and timed for maximum impact. Just as the monarchy had begun stabilizing after months of tension, a letter surfaced in the hands of a foreign journalist. A letter marked in Anne's unmistakable handwriting, dated just months after Diana's tragic death. It wasn't addressed to anyone by name, but the message was laced with emotion and veiled confessions. The language was carefully coded, but for those who knew how to read between the lines, it was damning. In the letter, Anne referenced a binding word given in grief, and her obligation to uphold a false image for the sake of a brother who could not carry it alone. One phrase stood out, not like a blade. The day will come when silence becomes betrayal. The timing was devastating. The monarchy was still in the fragile stages of reshaping its image when this ghost from the past returned to haunt them. And it wasn't the press that struck first, it was the public. Social media exploded with speculation. Headlines painted Anne as a tragic heroine, a royal Cassandra whose warnings had been ignored, while others labelled her a traitor who waited too long to speak. Who leaked the letter? Was it a former aide seeking revenge? A royal family insider aiming to force change from within? Or had Anne herself planted the seed to bring the truth into the light without openly defying the crown? No one knew for certain, but every theory carried weight. As chaos erupted beyond the gates, Charles moved swiftly. Damage control began immediately, calls to editors, quiet pressure on outlets, carefully worded statements about privacy and distortion. But the words rang hollow. The letter was real. The handwriting was real. The emotion was undeniable. And Charles's silence on the contents spoke louder than any denial could. Every public appearance was now shadowed by whispers. Cameras caught flashes of tension, forced smiles, eyes that no longer met. And through it all, Anne said nothing, not one word. Her silence became its own storm, fueling the mystery, feeding the fire. Some interpreted it as dignity, others as guilt, but those closest to the palace knew this was the calm before something far more powerful. Within the royal household, staff whispered about fractures that couldn't be mended. Old alliances began to shift. The unity that once masked decades of wounds was now unraveling in real time. The promise, once locked away in the private corners of Anne's heart, had burst into the global spotlight, and the monarchy had no idea how to contain it. But Anne wasn't done yet, and what she revealed next would change the legacy of two monarchs, forever. No royal had ever said this on camera. In an unprecedented interview, Princess Anne sat before the world not as the dutiful daughter or stoic sister, but as a woman haunted by truth. And in that chilling hour, the promise was no longer a rumor. It was real. And it was broken. The announcement stunned even seasoned royal watchers. After weeks of speculation following the leaked letter, a single statement from the BBC confirmed what many believed impossible. Princess Anne had agreed to sit down for an unfiltered, one-on-one interview. No palace script, no protective editing. Just Anne, a microphone, and the truth she had carried for decades. Teasers flooded the media. A royal betrayal the world deserves to hear. They read, the monarchy braced for impact. What emerged was more than confession, it was combustion. Anne began calmly, but there was a tremor beneath her composure, the kind born from years of restraint finally reaching their breaking point. She didn't hesitate when the interviewer asked about the letter. Yes, she said. I wrote it. I made a promise. Not for glory, not for politics, for my brother. The room fell silent. For the first time, the veil was lifted. Anne confirmed the vow was never about her own views on Camilla, but about Charles's quiet plea during the darkest chapter of his life. He asked me to help protect what he couldn't rebuild himself, to hold the line until the public could forget. I did that, for years, but I never agreed to rewrite history. And then came the words that echoed across the globe. I remained silent for Charles, but never for Camilla. The gravity of that statement couldn't be overstated. Anne didn't speak with vengeance, she spoke with sorrow. She described the pain of being used, of being discarded, once her silence had served its purpose. The confession wasn't a calculated act of rebellion, it was a reckoning with herself, and it shook the monarchy to its core. Millions tuned in, their eyes glued to a royal unraveling that felt less like scandal and more like heartbreak. The public response was electric. For every voice that condemned her as disloyal, 10 more hailed her as brave. Across social platforms and news outlets, hashtags surged. Truth from Anne trended globally. Commentators debated whether she had fractured the institution or saved it from itself. Inside the palace, the mood was colder. While Anne was being praised in the streets, royal aides worked overtime to mitigate the fallout. Charles made no public appearance. Camilla cancelled engagements. Tension seeped into every corridor. And yet, Anne remained composed, standing not as a rebel, but as someone who had endured the weight of a promise that was never hers to carry alone. Her revelation became a line in the sand, one that separated the monarchy's carefully preserved myth from the raw, human flaws it had long concealed. But Anne's revelation wasn't the end, it was only the first fracture in a much larger collapse. Anne's truth became a wrecking ball, and within days, the carefully staged unity of the royal family crumbled. Allegiances shifted, trust eroded, and the monarchy was now staring down its greatest crisis since the abdication. The House of Windsor was bleeding, and the wounds were all internal. Inside the palace, Charles was incandescent. According to those closest to him, he felt betrayed beyond repair. Not by the media, not by the public, but by Anne, the sister who had stood beside him in silence for decades, had, in his eyes, thrown open the gates and let the storm in. Behind closed doors, he reportedly called it a knife to the spine, accusing her of shattering not only their personal bond, but the very image of royal strength they had fought to preserve. The fury wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Because this wasn't just about a promise. It was about control. And that control was slipping through his fingers. William found himself caught in a storm, not of his own making. While his father raged, he remained eerily silent, trapped in a moral vice. On one hand, his loyalty to Charles was unquestionable. On the other, Anne had always been a compass, steadfast, honest, unshakable. Her truth forced him to look at the family differently. Insiders whispered of tense exchanges, of William walking a tightrope between diplomacy and devastation. He didn't speak publicly, but his absence at 2 major royal events in the days following the interview said enough. The heir was distancing himself carefully, quietly from the explosion at the center of the crown. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, vanished from public view. Her refusal to make a statement only deepened suspicion. For the tabloids, it was blood in the water. Every move or lack thereof was dissected, analyzed, condemned. Her silence became a vacuum, filled with whispers of guilt, manipulation, and backroom power plays. Some questioned whether she had always been the intended queen, or if Anne's truth revealed a version of the monarchy crafted not by destiny, but by design. Camilla's absence gave the impression not of dignity, but of avoidance. and the public noticed. The royal institution, now under siege from within, scrambled to contain the damage. Engagements were quietly cancelled, scheduled appearances were erased. PR machines worked overtime drafting statements that never saw daylight. Advisors urged calm while whispering panic. Even as they tried to steady the ship, they made a quiet but unmistakable move. Anne was stripped from multiple ceremonial duties, her name omitted from key documents. It was meant to be subtle, but the public saw it for what it was. Punishment. And they didn't like it. Outrage flooded in. Petitions circulated. Support for Anne surged once more, framing her not as a rebel, but as a scapegoat. The press, emboldened by the chaos, began digging deeper. What they found wasn't just one fracture, it was a pattern. Old footage resurfaced. Past moments suddenly took on new meaning. A cold glance here, an awkward silence there. For years, the family had masked its dysfunction behind protocol. Now, with one voice speaking truth, the mask had slipped. What Anne had started wasn't a rebellion, it was a reckoning, one that pulled back the velvet curtain and revealed a family grappling not with enemies but with itself. And while the palace burned behind golden gates, a forgotten recording from the past added fuel to the fire. Buried deep in the royal archives was a forgotten voice memo never meant for public ears. But when it surfaced, it dismantled decades of palace narratives. A conversation between Anne and Charles, raw and unfiltered, recorded in secret. And its contents? Utterly damning. The recording's origin was murky, but its impact was immediate. Sources traced it to a hard drive stored within a batch of archived internal communications from the early 2000s, unearthed during a routine digital audit, and somehow, mysteriously, leaked. Its timing was chilling. The monarchy was already staggering from Anne's televised confession, but this tape? It didn't just support her claims. It exposed the truth in Charles's own voice. The conversation took place during one of his darkest personal periods, a time when public opinion had turned against him, when Camilla was still hidden in the shadows, and the wounds of Diana's death were still fresh. In this deeply intimate exchange, Anne could be heard urging her brother to slow down, to reconsider his plans to bring Camilla fully into the public eye. Her voice trembled with concern, not rebellion. "You're asking too much," she said. "The country isn't ready, and neither are you." But Charles wasn't pleading, he was cornering. "You promised me, Anne," he replied. "Don't make me do this alone." That sentence, just 7 words, became the fuse. It reframed everything. This wasn't a shared act of protection. It was emotional leverage. The vow Anne had carried like a shield was revealed to be a manipulation designed to make her silence serve Charles's long-term strategy. He hadn't asked her to guard the monarchy, he'd asked her to guard his personal path to redemption. The implication was staggering. For years, Anne had been shouldering a burden that wasn't hers, out of loyalty to a brother who had weaponized her sense of duty. The most devastating moment came at the end of the tape. Just before the audio cut out, Anne's voice, steady, strained, but resolute, delivered a final line. "One day, I will speak, even if it breaks us." And now, that day had come. The media pounced. Experts authenticated the audio within hours. Voice analysis confirmed its legitimacy. Commentators who once dismissed Anne's revelations were forced to reconsider. The court of public opinion shifted violently. Charles's defenders fell silent. His critics sharpened in their attacks. And Camilla's silence, already controversial, now looked damningly calculated. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a collapse of credibility. Public reaction was thunderous. The recording humanized Anne in ways no interview could. She had tried to warn him, she had tried to protect him, but she had also drawn a line Charles had crossed the moment he used her loyalty as a tool. For the public, it was no longer a matter of opinion. It was documented truth. The fracture in the royal family wasn't caused by betrayal, it was caused by exploitation, and the world finally saw what Anne had carried alone for far too long. But amid the chaos and scandal, a question lingered. What had all this cost Anne personally? In giving everything to protect her brother, Anne lost something she could never reclaim herself. Behind the headlines and regal silence was a woman who bore the weight of a kingdom's secrets. And when she finally broke her silence, it wasn't revenge, it was survival. For decades, Anne had worn her restraint like armor. To the world, she was the unshakable royal, the dependable daughter, the no-nonsense sister who carried on when others faltered. But privately, she unraveled in quiet corners, behind guarded doors, where no cameras ever reached. After her explosive interview and the damning tape's release, Anne chose not to disappear but to finally explain the cost of her silence. In a rare follow-up statement, she acknowledged years of anxiety that began not with scandal, but with the night she made that promise. She spoke of sleepless nights, of therapy sessions where she battled the crushing guilt of upholding a lie she never believed in. Her confession was raw. I stayed silent for him, but I began losing parts of myself I never noticed until they were gone. The aftermath didn't just sever her bond with Charles, it redefined it. Their relationship, once forged in trust, had been hollowed by manipulation. In the final months, before the interview, they reportedly spoke only through aides. There was no apology, no reckoning, just silence. And with Camilla, any pretense of civility vanished. Anne kept her distance. At public events, she stood farther. At private ones, she didn't show at all. The family was fractured, not by scandal alone, but by the truth they could no longer control. Yet even in the wreckage, Anne stood with quiet dignity. She didn't lash out. She didn't name names. She let the silence speak for itself. But while the crown turned in on itself, the public turned toward her. Overnight, Anne became something she had never aspired to be, a symbol. Not of rebellion, but of integrity, of truth told at a cost. Tributes flooded in from across the globe, letters, portraits, speeches. For many, Anne had become the voice of a generation tired of illusion. She wasn't perfect, and she never pretended to be. But she was honest, and in a world drowning in pageantry, that honesty became revolutionary. Universities began citing her case in lectures on institutional reform. Politicians subtly referenced her courage in parliamentary speeches. And within the palace, something began to shift. Quiet reforms followed. Roles were redistributed, protocols updated. The monarchy, known for resisting change at all costs, began opening tiny doors to transparency. It wasn't a revolution, but it was the beginning of one. And through it all, Anne remained mostly out of view until one final statement, released months later, just 13 words long. I broke a promise, but I kept my soul. That is enough for me. With that, she closed the chapter, not in bitterness, but in liberation. But even as Anne finds peace, the monarchy must now confront the reckoning she left in her wake. The royal family has weathered wars, divorces, and abdications, but never a rupture like this. With Anne's truth now etched in history, the crown stands at a crossroads. Will it adapt and endure, or has the age of silent sacrifice finally come to an end? What began as a single confession has now transformed into a defining fault line in the House of Windsor. The monarchy, once shrouded in mystique and tradition, now stands exposed, its symbols intact, but its soul questioned. Public perception has shifted permanently. The crown is no longer seen as an infallible institution, but as a fragile family, deeply human, deeply flawed. For the first time, reverence has given way to reckoning. Across the nation, people no longer whisper about what lies behind palace walls, they demand to know. Anne's act cracked the illusion, and there's no sealing it back together. Analysts, historians, and insiders remain divided. Some argue that Anne's truth shattered the very thing she once sought to preserve. That her words, though honest, dismantled decades of stability. But others believe she did what no one else dared. She held a mirror to the monarchy and forced it to see itself without makeup. In a world shifting toward transparency, Anne's courage wasn't a betrayal, it was a lifeline. Perhaps, they say, she didn't break the monarchy. Perhaps she saved it from itself. Charles continues to reign, but not unscarred. The revelations surrounding the broken promise have carved a permanent mark into his legacy. No matter what reforms are introduced, no matter how many public smiles he offers, history will remember the vow, the tape, and the fracture that followed. His reign, once imagined as a period of graceful continuity, is now defined by emotional upheaval and internal division. A monarch crowned, yes, but also a brother exposed. A man whose path to the throne was cleared not only by loss but by silence weaponized. William and Kate have seen the storm up close, and quietly, without fanfare, they have begun recalibrating their approach. Plans once dominated by ceremony and tradition are now being shaped by realism. They know the future cannot be built on illusion. Advisors close the couple speak of a new chapter, one where honesty, accessibility, and emotional intelligence take precedence over protocol. Anne's reckoning has become their warning, and they are listening. As for Camilla, she continues in her role, but the warmth once cautiously granted to her has faded. Though the crown rests on her head, it does not rest easily. The public's affection has cooled. The silence she chose in the wake of Anne's revelations is remembered as a silence of convenience, not strength. She remains queen in title, but the court of public opinion has rendered a quieter, more lasting verdict. And so, the monarchy marches forward, not untouched, but undeniably altered. The legacy of the promise echoes across every palace hallway. A simple vow, whispered in desperation, reshaped history. It wasn't the scandal that broke the crown, it was the silence. The silence that cost a sister her peace, a brother his honor, and a nation its illusions. Because in the end, some promises aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be broken to set history free. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.